Lawyers for the two women returned to court in a dispute over legal costs. Rebekah Vardy has been accused of trying to derail the latest stage of her Agatha Christie battle with Coleen Rooney by launching a fishing expedition for documents. Lawyers for the two women have since returned to court on Tuesday, February 11, after an earlier ruling ordered Mrs. Vardy to pay 90% of Mrs. Rooney's legal costs, after she lost a legal action alleging libel in 2022. Her lawyers are disputing the sum, and at a hearing on Tuesday applied for further information about retainers between the wife of former Manchester United and England striker Wayne Rooney and her solicitors. The £1.8 million bill includes £302,300 and 39 pence in VAT, but some of it has already been reclaimed by Mrs. Rooney's solicitors, the High Court heard. Lawyers for Mrs. Vardy, the wife of Leicester City striker Jamie Vardy, are asking the court in London to order Mrs. Rooney's team to hand over privileged documents. In written submissions, Robin Dunn, for Mrs. Rooney, said that despite the hyperbolic nature of the claimant's argument, there is no genuine issue at all. He added, the defendant is forced to conclude that this is yet another attempt by the claimant to conduct this assessment in a wholly disproportionate manner. Mr. Dunn also said, the court is invited to extinguish this fishing expedition. There is no genuine issue and the VAT point has been clarified. The claimant's application is misconceived, seeking orders which the court has no jurisdiction to make, but moreover is an attempt to derail this assessment. This will lead to yet more costs and delay, which is in neither party's interest. Jamie Carpenter KC, for Mrs. Vardy, told the court that the situation over more than £300,000 in VAT is murky, to say the least, and that further disclosure is needed to know the VAT is properly claimed. In his written submissions, he said, what has emerged gives rise to a number of further questions, which needed to be answered. Mr. Carpenter added, it is submitted that it is not an answer simply to say that all of the VAT has been repaid, though the evidence does not presently support that in any event, because it leaves open the question of whether it was properly reclaimed in the first place. He also said that these issues need to be cleared up now, adding, further, the amount of VAT which is in issue is a clear obstacle to settlement and the avoidance of a further hearing. In a 3-day hearing last October, lawyers for Mrs. Vardy argued that the sum she is required to pay should be reduced due to what they said was serious misconduct by Mrs. Rooney's legal team, who allegedly deliberately understated her costs. But the judge concluded Mrs. Rooney had not committed any wrongdoing. Senior costs judge Mark Whalen said he will give judgment at a later date. Mrs. Rooney claimed she spent a total of £1,833,906 and 89 pence to go head-to-head with Mrs. Vardy. Mrs. Vardy launched an appeal bid against a recent ruling on Mrs. Rooney's legal costs last year in the Agatha Christie battle. In a 3-day hearing in October 2024, lawyers for Mrs. Vardy argued that the sum of Mrs. Rooney's costs should be reduced due to what they said was serious misconduct by Mrs. Rooney's legal team. But senior costs judge Andrew Gordon-Saker found on balance and, I have to say, only just that Mrs. Rooney's legal team had not committed wrongdoing. Therefore, he said, it was not an appropriate case to reduce the amount of money that Mrs. Vardy should pay. Mrs. Vardy mounted the legal action after Mrs. Rooney, the wife of former Manchester United striker Wayne, publicly accused someone using Mrs. Vardy's Instagram account of leaking private information about her to the press. Mrs. Vardy sued her for libel, but Mrs. Justice Steyn found in July 2022 ruled that the allegation was substantially true and she was ordered to pay 90% of her legal costs including an initial payment of £800,000. Mrs. Vardy's lawyer Jamie Carpenter KC argued that was disproportionate.